From 1998 until 2001, the Dreamcast burned brightly, but that dream came to an end early, and as a result, many games, both announced and unannounced, were abruptly cancelled. As new games released on other platforms, however, many Dreamcast fans wondered, would these games have been possible on Sega's console? Well, with the unofficial release of Grand Theft Auto 3 on Sega Dreamcast, we finally have an answer for at least one of those questions. You see, Grand Theft Auto 3 is indeed possible on the Dreamcast, and this remarkable homebrew conversion is the proof many of us have long waited for. Of course, one of the things I was most curious to see for myself is how it stacks up against the PlayStation 2 original. So today I'll walk you through what this port offers, I'll share comparisons with the PS2 version of the game, all while discussing some of its limitations and amazing new features and how some of these things will be solved in time. So, let's dive in. GTA 3 itself really needs no introduction. It was a cultural event after all, but before GTA 3 took the world by storm, the development team, DMA Design, had released Grand Theft Auto games across PlayStation, PC, and yes, the Dreamcast. That's right, the second game, GTA 2, received a port to Dreamcast during its short life, but the result is, well, not that great. It runs at a poor frame rate and generally doesn't take advantage of the system. It also had very little impact on sales. You see, GTA, while popular, was nowhere near as popular as it would become. Still, it's an interesting footnote that suggests perhaps we could have seen GTA 3 on the Dreamcast had it survived, and seeing this new conversion really highlights just how much more impressive it really is. So, for starters, the Dreamcast version is derived from the RE3 reverse engineering project, and if you download it from their website, you actually need to provide the PC version of the game yourself in order to extract the necessary data and convert it to the proper file formats. You can't just download an ISO here. It's currently optimized for use with any number of optical disc emulators such as the GDEMU, which replaced the Dreamcast optical drive, but it's also possible to play from a burnt CDR, though there are some caveats here. Emulator compatibility is very low currently, and I was not able to get it properly running on emulation just yet. This is likely due to how much it actually pushes the real hardware. Fundamentally though, this is the complete version of GTA 3. All missions, maps, cutscenes, audio, and more have made the cut, albeit with some reduction in quality in certain spots, which we'll touch on later. So without any further ado, let's jump into the comparison, shall we? While GTA 3 has been released many times over the years, I wanted to stay contemporary here and compare it with the original PlayStation 2 release. In capturing the game, I used original consoles in both cases, but with the PixelFX gem installed in each of them, enabling pristine digital HDMI output. So the first thing I want to address is a visual effect that I won't use in most of the comparisons, but I think it's important. It's called the Trails feature. This is effectively an accumulation style motion blur, which uses previous frame data to create a sort of post-process motion blur effect. It was very common during this generation of games. It also helps blend colors together to create a unique looking presentation, which is central to the GTA 3 visual design language. The Dreamcast is not well suited to this sort of effect due to its unique memory arrangement in how it deals with textures and frame buffers. Basically, from what I'm told, if you try to use the frame buffer as a texture, i.e. a copy of the full frame, you get 2 good pixels followed by 2 incorrect pixels. It basically doesn't render correctly. That did not stop the team, however. They have implemented 2 types of selectable trails, implemented in a slightly different way. The first type resembles the PS2 effect, but due to its hacky nature and errors in frame selection, it produces results like this. Individual trails are close together on PlayStation 2, giving it a motion blur-like appearance, but on Dreamcast they're spread way out, creating these huge gaps between individual ghost frames. It also has a cost on Dreamcast, which does impact performance. The second type works differently and produces a more mild but less distracting effect in comparison. While this type of accumulation blur was common on PlayStation 2, Xbox, and the like, the Dreamcast really just isn't well suited to use it, though I'm sure many would argue this is a positive thing. I just wanted to highlight that the team has been working on this effect and should improve it in time. But for the rest of the comparisons, I will disable it. So let's rewind the intro, but this time without trails enabled. This fast-moving scene is very nice and comparable early on, but once we get to the back alley, I did notice some minor texture blending issues here on the wall, but also differences in the character models. The reason, the Dreamcast version extracts data from the PC version of the game, which featured changes to the character models, which is something we should keep in mind. It also means that there's sometimes additional objects present in scenes that are absent on PS2. As you can probably tell, however, in this early version of the game, texture resolution was sacrificed in order to fit in memory. During the conversion process from the PC, textures are reduced across the board compared to other versions of GTA 3. Now, this may seem odd if you know anything about the Dreamcast, but according to SKMP, lead on the project, it comes down to memory limitations, but not necessarily due to the textures themselves. You see, the game sends a huge amount of vertex data to the GPU, and the GPU needs to store all these vertexes in memory before rendering them. While quaint by today's standards, the large size of the map and number of objects on screen means that GTA 3 pushes a fair amount of geometry around. So while Dreamcast has 8 megabytes of VRAM versus 4 on PlayStation 2, due to how the system works, vertex data ends up eating more than half of the system's VRAM pool. If you subtract frame buffer data and other VRAM resident objects, then they're only left with 2.3 megabytes of VRAM for use with textures. In addition to reducing the size, all textures are further compressed down using Dreamcast's VQ texture compression. But it turns out that VQ texture compression is not super well suited to compressing these palletized textures used in GTA 3, so additional artifacts rear their head as well. But there is still hope. The team is working to overcome this, and in time, we should start to see stable builds capable of loading full resolution textures, or at least the most important textures will be upgraded. There's still a lot of work to be done. You may have also noticed issues with the game's lens flares and lights. Headlights from cars and such. They clip through the world and various objects. Now, this is also something the team is still working for. There's currently a sort of depth mismatch happening here, but these lens flares are basically 2D objects projected on top of the world geometry. You'll also notice issues with things like the moon appearing in front of the scenery, which is obviously not correct either. The closer you look, the more you'll find these small issues where things aren't quite right, but remember, this is still very much an alpha build and the team is actively working on it. I'm told they're only really 1/3 of the way to where they ultimately want to be. So think of this as a snapshot in time, right? By and large though, those are the main limitations I noticed in terms of visual issues, because otherwise what we have is something that's very close indeed to the original game. So let's drive around a bit after the intro here, and you can really appreciate what's been achieved. All the main visual elements have made the cut, aside from some of the issues I've already mentioned. The light maps, shadow textures from trees and light posts, the light halos, lighting from street lamps, traffic lights, fogging, and more. It's all here, and it works. Yet one of the most impressive things about this port isn't something you necessarily see on screen, it's the streaming system. Part of this is down to GTA 3 itself being designed around optical disc-based data streaming, so there's a lot of leeway there. But the game was also written in a way to take advantage of PlayStation 2's vector units and additional memory, making it fairly challenging to implement on Dreamcast, especially given that it has half the system memory of the PS2. The game tries to keep as much data in memory as possible during gameplay then, and this is to help avoid hiccups while moving around the world. A separate thread dedicated to streaming handles data fetches from the source media, and the initial release was optimized for use with the GDEMU optical disc emulator or other comparable options, that is, putting an ISO on a piece of solid state. Yet, I'm actually using a burnt CDR. The team actually sent me an updated build that prioritizes CD-ROM performance, and it works extremely well. You see, in the initial build, every time the game would load in a new sound effect, it would cause the entire game to seize up momentarily, making some missions feel nearly unplayable. But now it works extremely well from CD, which is a real achievement, I think. Of course, getting it to fit in this amount of space was also something that required some cuts, and things like audio don't sound nearly as crisp and nice as the original version, but hey, all the music is here, all the voice acting, everything still made it in.
I know a place on the edge of the red light district where we can lay low, but my hands are all messed up, so you better drive, brother. I know a place on the edge of the red light district where we can lay low, but my hands are all messed up, so you better drive, brother.
Taking you through another set of non-stop rock and pop. It's Head Radio.
But okay, knowing all that then, what about performance? Again, keep in mind that this is still very much an alpha build. Performance is set to improve, hopefully. Before I get into the various permutations though, I wanted to start with this, a comparison with PS2 versus Dreamcast. The Dreamcast version has the V1 trails enabled, which are the closest match for PS2, but also rather expensive. When enabled, the frame rate is capped at just 15 frames per second on Dreamcast. Going above this doesn't currently seem feasible, though I'm told again that there are plans to further optimize, and we will hopefully see around 20 FPS with these trails enabled. I was really just curious to see how it compared to what is the default state of the game running on PS2. And that's what made this graph so interesting to me as well, because it also helps explain why GTA 3 looks so choppy on PlayStation 2 compared to later installments in the series. While the average frame rate is obviously higher than Dreamcast, it's still very much unstable, averaging around 26 FPS, and more noticeably, there's uneven frame delivery. There's a lot of these random 16 millisecond spikes. I always noticed this issue back in the day, but I couldn't really explain why it felt so much less smooth compared to its contemporaries. I just assumed it was always under 30 FPS, and while it often is, there's more to it than that. I think people were more forgiving though due to the revolutionary design of the game, but at least now we know why it feels this way. Of course, on Dreamcast, if you enable the V3 trails, the frame rate does increase noticeably, but it's still firmly in that 20 FPS territory most of the time. I should note that the V3 trails are enabled by default in the menu, so this is what you're likely to experience when you first boot up this version of the game. Just driving around the initial island, though, is somewhat less demanding than what comes later, so let's go over to Stoughton Island. This is essentially GTA 3's equivalent to Manhattan, and it's much larger and more complex. Whether you have V3 trails enabled or not, the frame rate is often very low on this island. I wound up exploring all 3 of the islands though in my testing, just driving around to see how the game holds up, and honestly this is what you're going to see most of the time. Given that the team is planning performance improvements though, I do think it will get better. Remember, this is still an early alpha build, the first release, but at this stage, the results are very promising and the game is already quite playable. I remember when they first showcased some of the development progress on this port, it was running at like 1 FPS or worse and things weren't even drawing correctly, yet here we are and the game is very playable. Now you can disable trails as I noted, and it does slightly boost performance, but it's still rather comparable. Actual frame pacing though is somewhat smoother than the PS2 version, so it actually doesn't feel that much worse despite the lower average frame rate. So yeah, right now this is the state of performance on Dreamcast, but expect things to improve in time. This whole exercise, though, kind of sent me down a rabbit hole, and it actually got me thinking about the PS2's own rather poor performance and what a new port of GTA 3 could look like. After all, years later, the PSP game Liberty City Stories was ported to PS2. The overall visual quality and performance was boosted here, using an updated version of the GTA 3 map. Traffic is way more dense, there's just a lot more going on in the city. The models are improved and smoother looking, things like fences and fire escapes and all the details that were absent in the original version are here. The lighting, I think, is a lot better, and of course the frame rate is much, much smoother. There's definitely a lot of headroom here on this system as well. And it also made me wonder if we could see ports of Liberty City Stories to the Dreamcast in the future. That seems feasible enough, right? But right now, this is where we're at with the original GTA 3. The Dreamcast version, in its current form, is still being developed, of course, but as a first release, it really is astonishing. It has so many cool features already, plus there's just a lot more to come. The game is indeed very playable in its current state as well, though currently there is a progress-stopping bug in the Bomb to Base mission, which makes it impossible to finish the game normally right now. But I think this will be fixed in the future. The key takeaway here, though, is that the Dreamcast development community is honestly just insane. These guys are super hardcore, and have managed to achieve what really does feel like a miracle port. Things like the aforementioned Trails effect, the motion blur, that's just not something the DC is set up to do well, yet they pulled it off. Yeah, it's a bit slow still, but it works. To be able to run such a large-scale game with every single effect that was on PS2 implemented into this build while running with the additional detail of the PC version is honestly just unbelievable. Personally, I'm a bit skeptical that Rockstar could have even pulled this off back in 2001. They were still learning how to make games like this in the first place, and the initial release is extremely rough on PS2, I would say. But of course, let's say that it did release on Dreamcast. This got me and many others wondering about what it might have meant for the Dreamcast in terms of sales. I suspect, though, given that the system had been discontinued for months at that point, that even if it were released on the Dreamcast, I don't think it would have made a big difference. But it certainly would have provided a cheaper entry point for playing what would become a very popular game. For me, though, this answers the question I've always had. Can the Dreamcast run Grand Theft Auto 3? Well, thanks to this team, we now know the answer. Yes, it can run Grand Theft Auto 3. But that's going to do it for today, so hopefully you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.